On a grey afternoon in August 1990, English football watched something it had no language for. Everton were being dismantled by Leeds United on the opening day of the season. The score, already humiliating, the crowd restless. Then, Neville Southall, one of the most respected goalkeepers in the country, walked a few steps forward and sat down on the pitch. No injury, no protest banner, just a man sitting alone in the centre of chaos. Within minutes, the verdict was decided for him. Pundits called it rebellion. Fans called it disrespect. Newspapers framed it as ego. That single image would follow Southall for the rest of his career, freezing him in time as a difficult man who thought he was bigger than the club. What almost nobody bothered to ask was why a man who had given Everton nearly 2 decades of his life would choose that moment to stop. To understand that silence, you have to understand the weight Neville Southall carried long before that day. Goalkeeping is football's loneliest job. You train with teammates, but you perform alone. You can be flawless for 90 minutes and still be remembered for one mistake. Southall understood this better than anyone. In the 1980s, he was not just Everton's goalkeeper, he was its foundation. While English football celebrated flair and aggression, Southall built a reputation on refusal. Refusal to be beaten, refusal to panic, refusal to perform for applause. He didn't fly for cameras. He stood still and made shots disappear. Strikers didn't score against him so much as bounce off him. His achievements stacked up quietly but relentlessly. League titles, FA Cups, a European Cup Winners' Cup, and 750 appearances for Everton, a club record that still stands. For Wales, he earned 92 caps, often playing behind fragile teams that relied on him to keep scorelines respectable. He was not flashy, not marketable, not comfortable in football's growing celebrity culture. He was dependable, and that, ironically, made him invisible. The more he saved Everton, the more the club relied on him without fully supporting him. By the late 1980s, that loyalty had begun to feel one-sided. The summer of 1990 was poisonous. Everton's transfer policy frustrated senior players. Promises were broken. The club was drifting, while rivals modernized. Southall submitted a transfer request, not out of greed, but exhaustion. 11 days later, he sat down. In his mind, it wasn't theatre, it was survival. The dressing room at halftime had been boiling with anger. His manager, Colin Harvey, was under unbearable pressure. Southall felt overwhelmed, overstimulated, mentally fried. When the ball went dead, he needed quiet. The pitch, suddenly empty of noise, felt like the only place to breathe. Football did not want that explanation. He was fined a week's wages. Former players demanded harsher punishment. A fan ran onto the pitch to lecture him about pride. The narrative hardened instantly. Southall became a problem to be managed rather than a human to be understood. That disconnect between how he felt and how he was portrayed would repeat itself again and again. As football changed in the 1990s, Southall didn't change with it. The Premier League era valued branding, compliance, and silence. Southall questioned authority, spoke his mind, and refused to flatter power. When his Everton chapter ended in 1998, there was no ceremonial goodbye. Instead, he drifted. Lower league contracts, short-term deals, dressing rooms where players knew his name but not his story. At Stoke City, he would later describe his time there as one of the darkest periods of his life. Not because of footballing failure, but because of isolation. He was no longer needed, only used. Even when he reached 41 and briefly returned to the Premier League with Bradford City, it felt symbolic rather than celebratory. A legend summoned in desperation, then discarded again. Crouching offered no refuge. Every appointment ended the same way. Too honest, too confrontational, too unwilling to compromise. His caretaker manager of Wales, he lasted 1 match. At non-league clubs, disagreements with chairmen ended his spells almost as quickly as they began. Football had no place for a man who refused to play politics. Eventually, the calls stopped, and for the first time in his life, Neville Southall had to exist without football defining him. That frightened him. He admitted he couldn't sit still, couldn't live comfortably on the money he'd earned. But in that restlessness, something shifted. Away from elite stadiums, he encountered people football never reaches. Disadvantaged children, young people, excluded from education and opportunity. He began working directly with them, not as a figurehead, but hands-on, listening, advocating, learning. Through them, He confronted the truth he had avoided throughout his playing career. He had struggled mentally for years without ever naming it. The fear of failure, the loneliness of responsibility, the emotional damage of being expected to absorb pressure without complaint. Long before mental health conversations became mainstream in sport, Southall had lived them in silence. When he finally spoke, it was disruptive. His book, Mind Games, refused to be a nostalgia tour. It addressed suicide, homophobia, addiction, racism, fear, and vulnerability. Topics football still finds uncomfortable. Coming from a man once mythologized as indestructible, the impact was undeniable. He reframed strength, not as emotional denial, but as honesty. The goalkeeper, once punished for sitting down, now explained why stopping was sometimes necessary to survive. Social media gave him a platform, and he used it in ways few others dared. Instead of self-promotion, he handed his account to survivors of abuse, mental health charities, and families affected by suicide. He openly criticized government policy, inequality, and football's hypocrisy. He rejected punditry, money, and comfortable retirement. Wealth, he admitted, would have softened his anger, and he didn't want to be so. In Wales, his advocacy finally aligned with institutional change. Mental health training programs were introduced to football clubs nationwide, equipping coaches to recognize warning signs and start conversations. Football, slowly and reluctantly, began to catch up to a man it had once dismissed as difficult. Looking back, the sit-down at Goodison Park no longer feels like defiance. It feels prophetic. A man prioritizing mental clarity in a culture that demanded emotional suppression. In an era where players now speak openly about anxiety, depression, and burnout, Neville Southall's moment reads less like rebellion and more like early satire, misunderstood because the language did not yet exist. Neville Southall will always be remembered as one of Britain's greatest goalkeepers, but his truest legacy may lie elsewhere, in choosing integrity over comfort, in using his platform for those without one, in proving that the most important saves of a footballer's life don't always happen in goal, but in the moments when they decide to stand still, speak up, and change the game beyond the pitch.